Hi, welcome to the Global Day of Jewish Learning. My name is Haim Aronovitz. I work for the Florence Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning, and we're thrilled to be able to be involved in this year's subject, Extraordinary Passages, about texts and travels. And the reason for that is because the essence of our work is really to do exactly that, to do on-site learning, to take the texts that take us on journeys, and actually, while we're journeying, studying the texts on site. So what I chose to do for this particular session was to focus on a very well-known story. It comes from part of the Babylonian Talmud. It's called, usually the way that people refer to it is as Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. The passage or the tractate of the Talmud that's relevant for us is called Gittin. And a get, I'm sure that you know, is a divorce. And Gittin really deals with that subject, but here we're dealing with it on another level, really. It's the subject of Gittin, of divorce between God and the Jewish people and its capital or its central city, Jerusalem. And so the subtext that I've given over there is one that's called Kamtza Bar Kamtza, Jerusalem, then and now. And the journey that I want to take you on there, therefore, is one in which I want to say that the extraordinary passage that we're going on is one in which we're looking at the city. We're going back 2,000 meters, 2,000 years, my apologies, and quite literally around 2 meters below present street level in Jerusalem. And we find ourselves going back in those 2 meters, somewhere in the region of 2,000 years. The Jerusalem then is a Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple and through to the period of the destruction. The Jerusalem now is a city rebuilt, a city that is the result of all sorts of political issues, all sorts of historical developments, which allowed for Jerusalem to be the city that I'm going to explore together with you now. And so let's take this title and keep in mind a phrase that was actually coined by a man by the name of William Faulkner, the great American writer, in which he basically said, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. And my claim will be that the now of our title will be relevant for that as well. Can we have a look then at an image that I'd like you to capture in the coming slide? Have a look closely at this picture. It's a picture taken after the Six-Day War. It's going to require of us a little bit of contextualization. Those of you who are familiar with the city of Jerusalem, those of you who are familiar with the old city of Jerusalem will be perhaps shocked by this picture, really. Because what you can see over there is the Jewish quarter, but almost raised. What you can see over there in the foreground, archaeological excavations. They're easy to identify because you can see that they're areas that have been uncovered in square grids. What you can see in the background is a tower both on the right and the left. And that will help you know that the one on the right is towards the area of the Jaffa Gate. The one on the left is in the Jewish quarter and to the back of the Jewish quarter, toward the southern end of the Jewish quarter. And what you're seeing is a result of a decision that was taken after the Six-Day War. Let me try and take you into that decision a little bit. Let me also help illustrate for you on what I'm basing a lot of what I want to share with you over the coming hour. This is a book that I'm hoping that the title will be clear enough to you. It's called Discovering Jerusalem. It was written by a man by the name of Nachman Avigad. Imagine the following story. He's really the hero of part of our story now. He's an archaeologist, professor at Hebrew University, where I'm sitting right now. In fact, when I look out my window, I look at the Institute of Archaeology of the Hebrew University to my left, but I won't take my camera there to show you. Nachman Avigad is not working over there. He's working in another part of the city. The year is 1967. The Institute of Archaeology that was established in the 30s hasn't sat on Mount Scopus for over 2 decades. It hasn't sat there because at the time of the War of Independence, the university on Mount Scopus was to remain Israeli-controlled territory that was an enclave surrounded by Jordanian-controlled, what we often call East Jerusalem. The photograph that you've got in front of you right now is an image that takes us to a very specific point in time. It's post-Six-Day War. It's a new situation. And that new situation is one in which a decision is taken that is going to have great consequences regarding the archaeology of Jerusalem. The decision that is taken is that they will rebuild the Jewish quarter of the old city. That area in the picture that looks such an area of destruction is going to be replaced by the buildings which many of the people online may be familiar with. And if you're not, come, I'll show it to you. Those people, let's go back to that picture number 2 just for another moment or two. Thank you. And those people who are looking at the picture need to come back with me into this image of the man who you can see a small figure in the forefront of the picture, the foreground of the picture. He's in a shadowed area, and you'll see that there's a man standing there. In a short while, we'll have a look more closely at that particular image. That is our friend Nachman Amigad. He's about to become Professor Emeritus in 1967, 1968. He has years of writing up of digs still to do before he can say that he's completed his life's work. And he's made an offer that at first he refuses. His offer is, would you like to head the excavations in the upper city of Jerusalem? You see, the area around the Western Wall, the area around the Temple Mount, the area beneath, the area of what we now call David City, all of those had been excavated. But the area of the Jewish quarter hadn't been excavated. It was built up, all houses, and no one had ever actually carried out archaeological excavations there. So much so that the buildings that you're seeing, if you look at your picture closely, where you see that there's a white patch of ground with a car in it, in the upper right-hand quadrant, that area was way beyond anything that had been excavated until then. And it wasn't far from there that they were later on going to find what Avigad was going to call perhaps his most important single discovery, what we know as the Broad Wall, or the signs of First Temple Jerusalem reaching that far, the walls of the city. But Avigad is offered this chance to lead the digs. And his first response is, I'm an old man, I'm in my late 60s. And his second response is, how can I not undertake that dig? How can I not undertake the dig that will help define our understanding of Jerusalem for whatever we may uncover? So let me say one more sentence about him before we move on to another picture. One of the principles that they take is, we will dig down until we hit bedrock. And whatever we find on the way, we will document. But we'll go through and sift through all the layers that will take us down to the bedrock and therefore uncover the story of Jerusalem. So let's have a look at that lower part of the picture in greater detail now. Okay, when you're looking over there, you can see quite clearly, let's see, I'm going to look at it with you. And I'm going to say that if I look on the left-hand side, I can see a number of mosaic floors. I'm going to look at them more closely shortly, but not just yet. From the left-hand back corner, you can see that behind that black square outline that I'm calling a mosaic floor as well, you can see that there's something there plastered in the wall, just behind it, defining the upper left-hand corner of the picture. If I look at the area which is darkened, I think that you'd agree with me that it's quite clear that we're looking into an area which is lower down. We're looking on another level of the excavation. The man standing there is standing on ground level, let's call it, and above his head there's an arch. Above that arch, look closely, and you see a series of steps there, taking you up to another floor, taking you up to what would be the third level of that construction. We've actually uncovered here a multi-leveled home. And the man standing over there happens to be our friend Nachman Avigad. I say our friend, now deceased, professor of archaeology at Hebrew University at the time, about to become emeritus. Let's go just a little bit further with the picture. Now what we've really done is started to focus that much closer. And I'm going to suggest that when we look at this particular image, If the last image showed us a multi-leveled home, this image is showing us some detail of that home. And if I want to ask what I would learn most from this, ask yourself that question really as well as I'm talking. We're looking at a close-up of the mosaic. Look at the waves, the energy invested in making those waves. Can you see the curls as they go slightly inwards and make that little detail there, whether it's red or black? Can you see the fruit in the corners of the next image? We've got the black frame. We've then got the white frame with the red and black curls. Sorry, my apologies. Let's just stay with that image a bit longer. And if we're looking, going in and in and in on this particular mosaic, we can see that there's another level then. And in all four corners, there are images which seem to be indicating fruit or items connected with fruit. Further in, and largely destroyed because of the plaster or the plaster that was placed on top of it for another construction, we can see that there's some sort of structure there, geometric, radiating from a center, which we cannot see in any detail whatsoever because it's all covered. But let me ask you this question. To make this level of sophistication of mosaic, would you agree with me that it requires a master craftsman? Would you agree with me that to make each wave look as detailed as it is, you have to make tiny pieces of mosaic, which are going to be the very, very equivalent of what we would call in our lingo today, if we had a Persian carpet or a beautiful Chinese rug, the number of knots per inch. Here it's the number of pieces of mosaic stone per inch. And each detail over here, and the decision to use shades to make the frame one color, and then the black frame, and then the waves, and thereafter the inner frames, and each of those details give us an indication that whoever made this mosaic would have been paid very handsomely for making it. There's a consequence. Whoever ordered it must have had the wealth to be able to do so. One last observation that I want to share with us about this image. And with it, we'll actually move on to the coming image as well. When you keep this image in mind and the coming one, and we'll have a look now at, I'm going to call it slide number 5, have a look and ask yourselves, is there anything in this image which would be contrary to your understanding of any of the 10 commandments? Most particularly the commandment that concerns graven images. In neither the previous nor in this one have we got any depiction of a person. If you come to visit this country and travel around and look at the mosaic floors that are found in synagogues in the 3rd, in the 4th, in the 5th century, you'll see that there's an increasing tendency to use images which would seem to be pagan images, and they are a direct effect of a minority group being affected by a majority culture, the surrounding Hellenistic culture, which has taken its hold on the minds of people living in the area. And through into Byzantine times, we'll find the depiction of figures becoming very, very prominent in many beautiful synagogue floors in the country. But we're now in a private residence. And I'm going to explain a bit more about that now, but I want to stay with this picture just that moment longer. There is no infringement of anything that has to do with graven images over here. Geometric form, again, a beautiful mosaic. And this mosaic too captures for us something about the people who are living in this home. So we know that they're careful about the laws. We even know that they must be pretty wealthy. They must have the wealth to be able to build in their homes, large homes, and more than that, decorate them very beautifully with very handsome equivalents of carpets, mosaic floors. Let's go a little bit further into a typical home then. And I'm taking you, there we go. I'm taking you back to the archaeological work that's being done over here just for a minute or two. And I want us, as we're looking at this image, there we are seeing in situ, in the situation in which it was founded, that mosaic floor that is being cleaned very well with the distinct walls around it, distinctive place within the larger home. Look at the ladder and beyond the ladder. They're uncovering another floor over there. You can see walls helping depict more or less the dimensions of the home. And a little bit later, I'm actually going to talk to you about those dimensions. But the question is, how much is one able to uncover, and how far down are you going to go? Let's have a look at just one more of these mosaics. I'm beginning to think that from the point of view of anyone listening in right now, you're probably thinking that I must belong to the Mosaic faith. In fact, what I am is incredibly impressed with the artistic abilities of the people who can create so beautiful and delicate a frame around part of the mosaic pavement that we're seeing in this particular image. So we're inside a larger complex, and I've tried to show you various parts of it, and I'm going to give you the bigger picture in just a few moments. Perhaps what we'll do is, in a slight change of order, I'm going to go, no, let's stay with the order that I decided beforehand, and let's take the coming image that will help us get a sense of where we are. You see, if I look over there, this image is actually a photograph that's taken while the excavations are still going on. And remember what I said to you that Avigad's mandate was, we dig down until we get to bedrock, because what's going to happen is that a Jewish court is going to be established above the area that we're working in. And therefore, you can see that by the time they have reached the level that we're on right now, homes are already being rebuilt and even lived in. And that's the example of the home that we see above and to the left-hand quadrant of this picture. From the middle of the picture down, you can see very, very clearly that there is a plaster wall there that's given us that flat surface with debris in front of us. We can see that on the plaster, there are indications of lines which seem to divide the plaster almost symbolically into large blocks. Remember that these people are designing and constructing their homes around the year, let's call it 50 of the Common Era. They have no idea what's going on at that point in time. The earlier home that we looked at some of, when we looked at the man standing underneath the stairwell, that home is slightly higher than the one that I'm now taking you into. If we're on the upper west side of Jerusalem, of the late Second Temple period, when the temple is still standing and functioning, when sacrifices are being carried out in that temple, when the people who are the population living in that area are primarily Jews, but maybe not all, and many of the people living in this upper west side are people who are connected with ritual, i.e. the priestly families, which we know of living in Jerusalem at the time. If I've gone to the year 50 now, unlike that first home, which has already been raised because of urban renewal projects and expansion of roads, we're now in another complex. And let's have a look in this gray and white photograph. We can't see much, but let's look at the coming image and get a different sense of part of this home. Here's another wall. But when we look at this wall, we have a very different image coming to mind. Firstly, those lines which I showed you on the black and white picture have been replaced now with rich color. But the rich color has been overlaid with another color, and that's black. If you look down at the bottom end of the picture, where the marking stick is as well, you'll see that the whole of the bottom area has been burnt. You can see that the walls have been covered with chars and soot. And when they were cleaned, what they found underneath were these images of colored walls. I'm going to come back to this picture again after the coming one, but I want you to try and imagine for yourselves when this particular picture could have been taken. So let's have a look at this particular wall and its location in the coming image, and then I'll be able to take you just that much further into the story that I want to study with you for the rest of our time. If I look at this picture, this diagram, it's a reconstruction that Avigad's surveyor did for him, a woman who produced some of the most astounding images of the way that homes were. And what I'm going to ask you to look at is just two elements here, perhaps. If you look at the very center of the picture, and I'm sorry that it's so small, I should have made it perhaps a bit bigger for you, but let's work from the sense of getting the whole scope of this home. In the very center of the picture, can you see that there's like an area that is surrounded by other walls. Above it, a very large room that has its own roof or ceiling cut out. And thank you very much for helping me make that image just that much larger for us. So the upper end in the center of our picture now is an image which, excuse me, I'm just trying to make sure that I can look at it as well with you. If we're looking at the upper end, the right-hand back wall of it, you can see is decorated with panels, which are also surrounded by drawings on both sides of them. Imagine that there's a ceiling covering that whole large room. Go out of its door at the bottom of the room, make a left turn, and you've come to that center space that I described before. That's the courtyard. That is an open space. Everything around it is going to have roofs or ceilings over. If it's a single story, it will have the ceiling and then the roof. If it's a double story, like that very large room, it will have a ceiling and then a second floor above that as well. Look at the ground plan of this home. It's a single mansion. It's a mansion that is so large that I have in not the courtyard, but in the largest room, the reception space, which is a little bit behind there. I have gone into that room perhaps with 80, 90 Melton seminars over the years. And each time we've gone into that room, I've asked people, do you have an entertainment space in your own home that is as large as this room? I once had a professor of medicine from England who said, yes, that's the size of my living room in St. John's Wood, my reception room in my home in St. John's Wood. He's almost the only person who's ever turned around standing inside that room and hasn't marveled that that room has no supporting columns to support the ceiling over a space which is quite easily 3 times the size of the living space in which I entertain Melton groups of up to 25 people when they come to visit me. That's a single reception space. That courtyard there is the courtyard around which the whole of this, I will say, multi-generational family. In all likelihood, the owner of the home had his parents or his wife's parents living with them. The children may have had their children as well. All of the bottom area is living spaces. To the right-hand side, almost from the middle going down, you can see stairs going all the way down to storage spaces. Ample storage spaces for all sorts of items like amphora. Storage for wheat, for olives, for olive oil, for water, cisterns all over. The whole of the central courtyard has a cistern beneath it. And if you look at the image of that courtyard again, on its right hand towards us side, you can see the opening for a little well to be able to draw water from the cistern that is underneath the courtyard itself. Go back into the large reception space and walk not into the courtyard by turning left, but go straight into the room that is on the left-hand middle side of this image. And let's take that image back to the previous slide that we had so that we can be able to see how that falls into our context. So let's have one image back again. I'm suggesting that we go to number 9. That's it. And as we look at it, I want to share with you a moment in time. That moment in time is the moment where, according to Josephus, the most important source that we have for the destruction, the period of the destruction of the temple, that historian Yosef ben Matityahu, in many ways, a figure that would be worthy of a session on this Global Day of Jewish Learning all unto himself, and maybe next year we can do that. But Josephus, when he describes what happens in the upper city, I called it the Upper West Side because that's what it is really. Josephus says that 1 month after the destruction of the temple, the upper city fell to fire by the Romans. And what I'm suggesting that we're looking at over here, and I suggest it not as an expert, but as a student of those archaeologists who examined this site so closely under the leadership of Professor Avigad, what we're seeing over there is part of a home of a very wealthy family, the family that could afford to build a home as large as we just saw, at the moment that their home was set fire in the month of Elul of the year 70 by the common calendar. It's a moment in time. It's 4 weeks after the temple itself was destroyed. But we have with amazing accuracy the description of Josephus telling us how those homes were destroyed by fire 1 month after Tisha B'Av. Let's go back to our previous slide, to the slide that we just had, the coming one. It's really slide number 10. And I say that the family that was living inside this home had all of the attention necessary for all of the ritual observance that a priestly family would have to be able to carry out in order to do their duties as priests. From here, from a home like this, from their neighboring homes, from the home above them, priestly families may well have used their private mikvahs in order to be purified, go through purification rituals, and then made their way across an access bridge that would have taken them straight into the confines of the temple so that they wouldn't have to mix with the riffraff and wait in line to use the many, many mikvahs that were at the foot of the temple, both on its western and mainly on its southern side. So these people were living in the lap of absolute luxury. And they are the source of the story that I want to study with you now. Let's make our way then to the story itself. And I'm going to ask that we go to page 11 now. And here we have the text, which gave us the title for our session. It comes from the Babylonian Talmud, as I told you. And the tractate, or the Masechet, is called Gittin. I said that too. Gittin is all about divorce. And the question that we're going to be faced with over here is what happens when, in a certain sense, either the people divorce themselves from God or God from the people. In fact, there's a wonderful midrash that we read and study on Tisha B'Av, that for 3.5 years, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, waited hoping that she, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, could return into the Holy of Holies, before she said she would go out into exile with her people. So let's look at this story. It's a story that actually begins as a commentary on a quote from the book of Proverbs. And I haven't given you that quote, but I'm going to read it to you now because I want to come back to it all the way at the end of our session as well. And the quote is, "Happy is the man who always is fearful, but he who hardens his heart shall fall into mischief." There's something here about hardening the heart, being too concerned with detail and too little concerned with reading the situation, which would seem to lead to mischief. And this commentary on this verse is going to be given to us by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan, as he takes us into the story that we're now going to study together. Remember one thing. The story as we have it in the Babylonian Talmud is redacted into its present form close to 450 years after the destruction of the temple. It may have been very close to this format through all of that time, but we have it in a form that means that hundreds of years after the destruction, this is the way that yeshiva bochers and anyone studying the Talmud would be encountering this story. So let's look at it together. It was because of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza that Yerushalayim was destroyed. Kamtza, Bar Kamtza. How close are those names? What is the origin of those names? Well, the root of that word, Kamtza, would seem to be a little gathering, a little bunch of something, a kometz. You know that in the Hebrew that many of us have had to study over the last 1100 years or so, we've had punctuation and we call that little 2 lines that make us that sign, we call that a kamatz, like the patach. Both of them giving us the a sound. But the kamtza and bar kamtza, that little kometz and the son of a kometz, that little gathering, that little bunch of stuff, is almost irrelevant. That's all that it is. It was only because of the difference between these two names that Jerusalem was destroyed. And the Talmud carries on and says, for there was a certain individual who was friendly with Kamtza, but was not friendly, was an enemy of Bar Kamtza. He made a feast, and he said to his servant, go and bring Kamtza to my feast. But the servant brought Bar Kamtza instead. It's the difference between inviting Cohen or Khan to your home. He should have invited Cohen, and instead he invited Khan. He should have invited Kamtza, and instead he invited Bar Kamtza. Well, the one who made the feast, by the way, do we know his name? So far not, and maybe never. The one who made the feast found Bar Kamtza seated there. And he said to him, since you are my enemy, what are you doing here? Get up and get out. Don't worry, I'm not getting out of this. Or if you are worried, maybe I should. The one who made the feast found Bar Kamtza sitting there, and he said to him, if you are here, get out of my home. I don't want you in my home. Well, just so far, look at the characters that we've got. Firstly, we've got a quote that we still have to try and work on, but we'll get to it later on. But now, the great sages are going to say to us that it's just because of this difference between Kamtza and Bar Kamtza that Jerusalem was actually destroyed. And now we're going to have to follow out how this goes. If you were Bar Kamtza and you were invited, would you not have been really surprised that you got the invitation? But remember, and don't for a moment allow yourselves to forget that the home in which our host is living is maybe as large as the one that we just saw. That it's decorated with the latest fashion in the whole of the Roman Empire. Those beautiful red colors. By the way, I don't think I would want to decorate my home that way. But the richness of that ochre, the richness of the other shades, they are the most fashionable colors in Rome. And it's almost for sure that the host had recently been in Rome and even said to his interior designer, these are the colors that I want you to use when you're decorating my home, because that's what's in fashion nowadays. So here comes Bar Kamtza. He enters this magnificent home. He may be inside that large room that we looked at a little while ago. And if he's inside that large room, what is he going to be able to see? He's going to be looking, excuse me for a moment, he's going to be looking at all of the beautiful trappings in the room. But he's also looking around at the people who are there. And the people who are coming into homes like this are going to be the mi vami, as we say in Hebrew. This is the high society. This is the Upper West Side. These are the people who, when you see them, you want to be seen as well. So what's Bar Kamtza's response going to be? He says, since I'm here already, let me stay. I'll pay for whatever I eat and drink. I don't need you to support me. I've got my own resources. How does the host accept that idea? No. I'll pay for half the cost of the feast. No. I'll even cover the whole of the cost of the feast. No. And he seized Bar Kamtza, stood him up, and threw him out. This is the situation that we've encountered. And let's get that setting more strongly in our minds. Let's look at some of the items that Avigad and his team actually found inside that home. So for instance, you can imagine if you're seeing these items over here, look at the magnificence of that jug. Look at its style. Look at the delicacy of the bowls. That back bowl may have held olives in it. One of the front bowls may have been just to get your fingers to get that oil off after you've taken an olive. Another may have been for the pits. Look at the magnificence of that marble table. I look at that table standing on a single leg, and I know that whoever designed it had a sense of proportion and of grace that is really, really impressive. And every time I go there, I ask myself, as I ask those who are coming with us on a seminar, I say, would you like an item like this in your home? And invariably people may say, it doesn't match what I have got, but if I had the right items in my home, this would be magnificent to add to my home. Let's have a look at another of these items. let's try and get a little bit of a sense. You know what? I'm going to ask that we just jump to number 17. Oh, that's pretty good as well. Okay. Have a look at that table. The legs over there are reconstructions. They're wooden legs. They would have been destroyed in the fire. At the top that we have over there, we have a number of them intact. And you can imagine that as you finish your hors d'oeuvres, as you finish either, as they used to say, your martinis, if you're only having one, or martini if you're having more, you would take your glass and place your glass on a table like this on the side, and some waiter would come along and immediately take the item away and clear the table. So let's go back then to our story. We're on page 14 now. And let's think of Bar Kamtza's mindset. Bar Kamtza now has been chased out. He's been embarrassed in front of all of his friends. And if they're not his friends, it's quite clear that he's not part of the high society because he's just been kicked out by the host. How should he have responded to the situation? Remember that all the time we're busy asking ourselves, when you harden your heart, you may fall into mischief. That's what the book of Proverbs says. But over here, was the host okay? Is Bar Kamtza okay? So far, when we're looking at the protagonists over here, the main characters in our story, they each seem to have hardened their heart. Let's go a little bit further. Bar Kamtza thought to himself, since the rabbis were there, the community leadership were there, they saw this whole thing, they saw me being embarrassed, they saw me being insulted, and they didn't protest. Obviously, they had no objection to my embarrassment. I'll go now and have a little feast of slander, is the Talmudic phrase that is used there, but basically, I'm going to go there now to badmouth the community with the king. And I think that it's a moment of insight for us that the word that appears in the Talmud is in fact Malka, the king, Melech. We also know that the Romans didn't have a king there. So let's try and understand how this title even gets into our story. But to do that, let's go a little bit further. Bar Kamtza went to the Caesar, to the Caesar, and declared, the Jews have rebelled against you. To which Caesar responds, who said so? And Bar Kamtza says, you send them a sacrifice and see if they're going to offer your sacrifice in their temple. Remember that the story takes place when the temple is still standing. Remember that now Bar Kamtza goes to the Caesar. Do you think that he went to Rome to report this story? And so I allowed myself, perhaps wrongly, to add the word procurator in brackets over there to allow us to get the sense that in all likelihood, he either went to the palace in Jerusalem that the procurator had, or went to Caesarea, that city on the coast, which was the center of Roman administration for the whole of the land. Wherever he went to, what's Bar Kamtza done? He's gone and turned upon his fellow communities, the fellows of his community. He's upset with the rabbis. He's upset with the leaders. In all likelihood, it wasn't so much that the room was filled with rabbis the way that we'd imagine it, as all of us have just imagined that sentence until a moment ago. In all likelihood, there are a whole lot of priests there. And many of them are there because they are part of the elite of the community. They belong to that part that many of us have studied about when we often think about what we call the Sadducees, the Tzedukim, from the word Tzedek, or from the word Tzadok. That lineage of priestly families who were really disconnected from the people. I want to suggest that this whole passage reflects the reading into the story of later generations, by which time the rabbis are the center of the story. And so Bar Kamtza thinks that the rabbis should have objected. And when he goes to the Caesar, he's really going to the head of the Roman administration in the land. Let's see what happens with that sacrifice. But before we move, one more question of you. The Caesar responded, who said so? Do you sense that the Caesar over here is another guilty party in the story the way that the story is being recounted to us. Let's try and learn a bit more, and let's move on to the next passage. The Caesar, as I've suggested, the procurator, certainly the head of the Roman administration, sent with Bar Kamtza a healthy, unblemished fine calf. That was going to be taken to where? To that temple, the most magnificent building in the whole of the Roman Empire. By the time this story, if it ever took place, is set, it's in the years before the destruction of the temple and in the 60s of that decade, of that period, of the first century. The temple was finally completed, decades after Herod's massive, massive work, which he was never to live to see in its final format. They are still doing the last of the works there decades afterwards, and as short a time as a decade before the destruction of the temple. So Caesar sends a healthy, unblemished fine calf. Is there anything wrong with that? It looks like he's respecting what we're asked to do. While going to the temple, Bar Kamtza, who's accompanying that offering, causes a disfigurement in the animal. Now you have to know that the whole idea of an unblemished animal is that it's got no impurity. There's nothing wrong with it. It's in perfect, beautiful condition. There are those in Jerusalem today who are still trying to raise a red heifer. Some say that the blemish was on the upper lip. Others say that it was a blemish in the eye. In any case, a place for which it would disqualify the sacrifice. But for the Romans, it didn't matter. Romans had their pagan ways of carrying out sacrifices. Jews had their way of doing it. For the Jews, the animal had to be unblemished. Let's pause a moment. A blemish on the upper lip, what do we use our lips for? We say at the end of the Amidah, may we not use our lips for speaking guile. And others say that it was blemish in the eye. We talk about the evil eye. We talk about looking at things. We talk about looking at people and looking at them askance. It's either by hearsay or by the words that come from our lips or by what we look at, by sight, that we often commit the most disastrous of our actions. Well, what's going to happen still? The rabbis had in mind to sacrifice it anyway. Should they sacrifice the Caesar's offering? By the way, halachically, there was no problem. Because being an offering from a non-Jewish figure, it did not have to carry out all of the elements of Jewish sacrificial requirements. But what is their reasoning? To maintain peaceful relations with the government. Many, many, many decades later, we're going to know that the tradition that we have is going to be that you always see that you have peaceful relations with the government. To this day, the prayer that is recited in synagogues around the Jewish world is for the well-being of the government. But Rabbi Zachariah, son of Avkulus, objected to doing that. He said, people will say animals with blemishes may be sacrificed on the altar. Here we have one of the rabbinic figures. Here we have someone in charge of clearing an offering, being able to say this or that can or cannot be offered on the altar. But here he says, if people see that slight blemish, whether it's on the lip for speech or on the eye for what one sees, one should not offer a blemished animal, because that will change the practice. People will start bringing such animals. Well, the rabbis didn't know how to respond to Rabbi Zachariah. Remember, he's great enough that we know his exact name. And we know that his importance is strong enough, that is important enough, that the rabbis actually have to debate about whether or not to accept his ruling. They thought maybe what they could do is kill Bar Kamtza, so that he wouldn't report what had happened to the Caesar. That is, if we don't offer it, then the Caesar shouldn't know that we didn't. And who's going to go back to him? Bar Kamtza. But Rabbi Zachariah, son of Avkulus, objected to that idea too. And he said, if one who makes blemishes in sacrifices is killed, if people should say that, then once again, we will be seen as being too much concerned with these details. He seems to be saying, we cannot do either. He seems to be behaving the way that we sometimes find in our own reality. figures who are there to allow us to understand how to use the law, who actually raise obstacles in the using of that law. So let's take this story just a little bit further, because who's responsible so far? Is the person responsible the host? Is the person responsible Kamtza? Is the person responsible Bar Kamtza? Is the person responsible one of the rabbis? Is it Zcharia, the son of Avkulus? Have a look at the way that Rabbi Yochanan, that great figure in Tiberias, looks at the story 250 years later. The excessive carefulness of Rabbi Zcharia, the son of Avkulus, destroyed our temple, burnt our palace, and exiled us from our land. How are the rabbis going to retain this story for the future? It would seem to be that the story is going to be retained for the next 1900 years. That it was actually the excessive carefulness of this figure, Zechariah ben Avkulus, who led to the destruction of the temple. There's one thing that's puzzled me with this story from the first time that I looked at it. Who destroyed the temple? It was the Romans. And yet the way that we look at the story in our tradition is that it wasn't them that we focus the blame on. Instead, we look to say that we, in our own actions, needed to be behaving differently. So let's just come back to strengthen our visuals for a moment and take the next image, which will show us, we've seen it, we haven't seen this image just yet, and I want it to be fresh in your minds because I want to strengthen the image of these families who were the great families of Jerusalem at the time of the fall of the temple. You see, in the ruins that were uncovered by Professor Avigad, they found two such items as you're looking at now. I had the privilege of seeing the original, both of them, on display at the Israel Museum last year, when a wonderful collection was put on display, was loaned to the museum. Unfortunately, it's in private hands and not owned by the museum. But if you're looking at this object, what must strike you about it is that firstly, it's pretty much damaged, isn't it? It doesn't have its handle in place. It doesn't have its spout in place. But would you believe that it's made of molded glass? And it has a name, if you look at the left-hand corner at the top there, in tiny writing from the book that I showed to you earlier on from Avigad, Enyon's glass vase from the Jewish quarter in a mold. He made it, he molded it. Who is Enyon? Well, on this very item, there's actually a signature on it that says, Enyon made this. It's something like what you would call, for those of you who came to Jerusalem maybe 20 years ago to see the display of glass by the greatest glassmaker of our times, a man by the name of Chihuly. When Chihuly had his exhibition, people from around the world made sure to get the chance to see it if they were visiting Jerusalem. So much so that they actually extended the exhibit for a period of almost double the amount of originally planned time. This is the Chihuly of the 1st century of the Common Era. This is the greatest glassmaker in the whole of the Eastern Roman Empire. And 2 of his vases and 2 of his jugs were found inside the Jewish quarter. For a family to have a Chihuly with which they serve people, or with which they place their flowers on display, for those items to be part of their living space, gives us a little bit of a sense of what was the life like for those who were living in the Jewish quarter at that time. So let's move to one last text that I want to look at with you. It comes from a passage that we call the Tosefta. In modern Hebrew, a Toseftan is actually an appendix for the doctors I'm talking. But when you talk about the Tosefta, we're talking about passages which were actually not going to be included in the Mishnah and therefore fell out of the corpus of the most important writings that were going to be edited and redacted somewhere around 100 and something years after the destruction of the temple. When Yehuda Nasi creates the Mishnah, he leaves out a lot of the oral tradition. What he leaves out becomes the Tosefta. And here we have from the Tosefta another way that the rabbis tried to deal with the story of the destruction of Jerusalem. Said Rabbi Yochanan ben Tota, on what account was Shiloh destroyed? Who knows what Shiloh is? Well, Shiloh is the place where before Solomon built the first temple, the Mishkan stood. The sanctuary was where the tables of the law were kept. And why was Shiloh going to be destroyed? Because of the disgraceful disposition of the holy items that were there. As to Jerusalem's first house or temple, on what account was it destroyed? Because of the idolatry, licentiousness, and bloodshed that marked it. Idol worship, licentious behavior, killing of people, those were the reasons why in the 6th century BCE, the first temple was going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. But what about the latter or the second house? We know that they devoted themselves to Torah and were meticulous about tithes. We know that in the homes that we saw that we found mikvahs. We know that they made sure to go to mikvah before they went to the temple to carry out their sacrifices, and they went to the mikvah before they offered their sacrifices. Both the priests and both the regular people were worried about every detail. Mikvah is not defined in terms of its practice in the Torah itself. It's religious law, it's halakha that develops around this time, leading up to the fall of the Second Temple, that we know exactly how and where we should do what. But if that's the way that they were behaving, if they were meticulous about tithing, if they were meticulous about all of the mitzvot, if they were to live in spite of that, in the luxury that we saw in those homes, then we understand the second part of the sentence. On what account then did they go into exile? Because they loved money and hated one another. That teaches us that this hatred of one another, and it's interesting that Rabbi Yochanan ben Tota has actually removed the other part of it. They loved the money, but the hatred of one another is evil before the omnipresent. And Scripture deems it equivalent to the three very sins, idolatry, licentiousness, and bloodshed, that led to the destruction of the first temple. I called this session, though, Then and Now. And I ask you to pause for a moment. I ask you to pause for a moment because we are looking at a society which in many, many ways sees itself, if we look at the text that you've got in front of you now, as the creation of the third house. And perhaps we'll take that text off for a moment and come back to the image of myself in teaching us. And I want to suggest then that this third house that we're talking about, the house that we have built in terms of the modern state of Israel, would do well to have a look at the passage that we just studied. Would do well to ask, is the behavior that marks the way that we lead our society the behavior that we can excuse? Is the way that contemporary Israelis look after this third house that we have built one that we need to worry about? And here I have to share that with every seminar that I've been on, where we've gone, and as I say, I'm talking about perhaps 100 times over the years, that each time that we go into those mansions, those homes that we found the remains of, each time that we go into them, I find myself asking, so when I go into this, what is going to be the manner in which people will dig up the Jerusalem of this century? What will they find in our homes? What will they understand about the way that we led our lives? But along with that, what will be the lessons that we wish to teach to the future as well? You see, Faulkner said that the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And I'm suggesting to you that the Talmudic discussion that is being held, perhaps even this morning, above that building that was excavated in the 1970s, after the Six-Day War, and before Jerusalem and the Jewish quarter was going to be rebuilt or built up, right above that mansion today is a yeshiva. And the passages that we've looked at together are studied in that yeshiva. But behind me, on all of these shelves that you see there, are innumerable newspaper articles questioning and asking, what sort of society do we want to build here? What sort of society are we building here? And how do we, as the Jewish people, look towards Jerusalem, that it may be rebuilt in justice? If you should wish to send any questions, you can send them in to theglobalday.org. I should have told you that in the beginning, that you can submit questions. I'm sorry that I don't quite know. But if anyone has already submitted, then I will receive them shortly. And in any case, if you're in Australia, you're coming towards the end of your studies, unless you're going to go all the way through to late night. But if you're only seeing this when you woke up in the rest of the world, then may you have a very, very wonderful global day of Jewish learning, extraordinary passages that will take you on journeys through text and through travel. Thank you very much.